0% product, and 100% promise. And that's a promise. I promise. Shampoo, right? Because bad monkey, right? You know, the alien overlord says to the consumer, right? Bad monkey, shampoo, right? Stop throwing shit at each other, right? Or study, right? That's the commercial. Shame-free. So that show where the advertising people are crazy, but really, so we open the eyes, right? And it's like, 0% product, 100% promise. And then machine intelligence, and then AI, right? So we already had a 0% product, 100% promise of time. Then AI. And then subsequently jokes. Because at some point the emperor wears no clothes. Right? Which means, comedians are funny. So when is that ever the case? You got 350 million people, right? How is it that there's nobody muted? I mean, that's not like entirely true, but coming up through the filter of time here laid down after 2012. It's like there's a blanket era of non-entity of taste, of product, progressively. That's the happy face virus. I just talked about it here. It's like the basic geometry of if you put a colon right before a parentheses that's facing left, and then another colon, right? That's the happy face virus in basic code geometry, right? It turns that happy face upside downy face, but you experience from the observer plane that it seems like a happy face, right? That's the encapsulator called identity politics in basic code science, right? To get you to handshake and accept a certificate, right? An agreement, a contract, right? A cookie, right? A member of the cohorts, and there was no product, right? It's simply non-choice, as if choice, and you go down a construct. Into something I call the title of this book, Time, as it is history, memory. You know, the axis of angle there. History and memory. History and memory. Memory and history. The horse and the cart. The cart and the horse. Are they the same thing, or are they a different thing? What is time? What is a constant? What is a construct? Good and evil. Hot and cold. Right? So good and evil aren't hot and cold. So before Neo wakes up in the Matrix, he's presented at the beginning, you're in the theater, within the scope of a construct already. This is the beginning of the confirmation bias, which is actually the equal sign being added, distance, right? Domain of influence shadow, and for there to be distance, i.e. something running on probabilistic certainty in interaction, obfuscation of form, generalistic. Any detection is of transmutation virus form field state generalistically in its impression in entrance vector prince A, cessation in the experiential construct, suppression insofar as you lose in the interface. And, you know, at no point in the equation of, as when it was presented, keep in mind this is not a normal occurrence for life. And maybe necessarily you would have evolved to the current state of form that you have. Right? But it's hard to say. You don't have that time line available in linear time. That's not how it works. So it's a parasymbiotic organism to be peeled off that has, by happenstance, placed us very complexly up the food chain and complexity of organism, but not necessarily as you were already at a complex state for interaction at its presence. That's the misnomer. Right? So how far back in time does it present in a literal fashion to something that's already highly evolved? I would say the 10097 Lyman 0 on the back wave. So the confirmation bias. Look at the lamp. The picture of this lamp. Ding. Just a lamp in my hotel room. But it's a good picture of when you have a hyperdimensional transmutation entity at all vectors of incentive at a certain date, generalistically, and then confirmation bias. So it runs on probabilistic certainty of non-detection, and once detected, goes genetically dormant and must be maintenance as such, like, you know, mold in a house. But it was nonetheless the catalyst, like a sorbet, the tree in the garden. reductionist de-evolution, why does the X chromosome miss so many things? Well, this splitting, you lose some in the handshake. What plants and animals have, fully formed personas of genetics and very low toxicity, right, in interaction. Very highly probable the reassemblage language of genetics for the Prometheus characters in that movie, or something similar. But and the other fault in the garden, let's talk about God's dog, right? The Yule and Dogme Festival. There's something about the entire character of the world sees that as necessarily a best friend, and most pointedly in practice, not man's best friend. It's not a small thing, because that's the thing. Because the genetic comes in through, and then turns at a genetic level forward, back to the future, reflecting its confirmation bias, kind of fruition as much as it possibly can within its domain window of literal expression within linear time. So, at the instant of probabilistic ability to fruition, the trapped harmonic of intent on a converged communication system that is largely middleman the observer interference domain claim, and then all of a sudden, since you don't understand observer-based physics at all, what you did is cause a hyperdimensional presence to confirmation bias as necessarily existing and affecting the timeline as it is. So the convergence and inception of, you got 7.5 billion people, right? They're all chaos. Can't be outside of an instantaneous moment, which is time is this history. Time is not a field constant, and fraction-based organism, which precedes the trapped harmonic, which is expressive in singular organism in space-time. Just like the shape of a black hole, its interference overtones upon, say, a single point, motioning into it, like in all inroads, you visualize the same form of induction from all dimensional angles. Right? That's kind of what this organism is and what you did. 2012 and the probabilistic fluid dynamic and visualization of form without desires design. That's important. So you have a trapped harmonic of intent. Middleman the interference domain, you put automation, which is what? It's like putting you put a box around something that is a curve. And in that right angle and curve simultaneously, the trapped harmonic, like lightning. Now that's the confirmation bias of form. And time is not a straight line, like I said. And in fact reinforcing logic, once confirmation bias occurs, we consider that division, the knowledge of division, is distance. And the confirmation bias of form is the acknowledgement of distance. And so, in linear time, we're moving away from the object's domain of influence. In effect, as it is without desires design, and that's that's why the genetics that propagate across space-time have a refraction organism fruition and design high-mindedly and hydratically, almost without desire, like complex autonomic organisms. And actually we are. I guess in the roll-off period, 22 over 7, rather than over the pi interfering pattern. So what is that I just said? So when those two patterns, 22 over 7 presents in its interference action at the absolute center of black hole, right? And that's when you experience a morphogenetic observer, see Rupert Sheldrake for morphogenetic field theory, observer domain middleman, and then instantaneous fluid dynamic probabilistic expression of, but then all the variables within the container that outflow that probabilistic curve outside the curvature of space-time reseated themselves because they're chaos inherently. But in that instant, predictive analysis maintenance a tangent of time that isn't in an extra-dimensional de Sitter space that printed an organism degrades. They are not aliens. They're human. And printed out of that glitch, the exponential elliptical curve, which was high, unabated by any other influence of interference pattern injection, such as 22 over 7, which is presented naturalistically at the center of black holes to cause a right angle and curve at the same time, because what is fire? Right? Fire is a right angle, and it's a fractal. Right? 22 over 7 is a curve. They're simultaneously expressed, it causes a glitch, a perfect circle form, and thus an aperture in a lens. And if there's gravitational intent in this conservation of energy process, it's refraction. And if you apply that to mind, and around the edge of space-time, it starts affecting matter, and then back reinforcing instantaneously up to that point confirmation bias. Right? So, but it's not an actualistic catalyst, like I said. It is a parasymbiotic extraterrestrial organism that's a part of the mammalian group. Genetic was formerly concern-free. Its plausible influence domain of 2012 to about 1918 approximately, and with banding over total. But that's the first presence of in the jungles of Asia, the Asiatic and isolated new continental drift continent, right, where humans were. And without this gene of homogeneous aesthetic that does exist, I promise you, when you remove the identity politics. So that's the first inject. And so to mistake the dye inject, the nuclear medical scan, and nonlinear space-time, 22 over 7 as the causal factor is a mistake. But like I said, it's until it exists in confirmation bias, a probabilistic eventuality that has occurred. And since it has occurred, it is the catalyst for current formulation of the mammalian general and dichotomy of terrestrial economic interaction with this parasymbiotic organism, which has myriad genetics attached and localized at its use to trying to bring that window in again to where pi goes, which it necessarily can't because you've already injected 22/7 into the die's history. That punctured its confirmation bias and thus the equal sign of distance. Right? So probabilistically in its basic concept necessarily can't reformulate unless a higher state of hydratic reductionist pi is expressed upon the interference domain of humanity at a exponential elliptic curve of fluid dynamic fruition and probabilistic seeding. So far as confirmation bias, feedback loop, and logic outside the curvature of space-time. Right? So we don't want that to happen again because each time it happens, it complexifies the loss of, within its domain of influence, dimensional experiential expression. And so to the tune of, you're going into an induction channel that's 5, kind of before 1907. And exiting an inlet that's 4 that kind of resembles RGB, right? And so you start within the construct at this point of, the spherical lens of influence that looks like the ship from Flight of the Navigator. Like if you made a clear form field of time hyperdimensionally, non-linearly, like the Rorschach of a black hole, insofar as it's a single ship or consciousness' entrance humanity into its influence domain. So, as you have a desire for quantum computing to also integrate into, what is that for? Computational whatever? Well, with logic, I can kind of deduce and engineers can necessarily most technologies that you use for, and maybe some other people cannot, everyone can, but that's an available capacity. So you have a counterintuitive motion of logic in the use case of tool set for rebuffering an attempt at reestablishing using that, quadratic rather than, and so in expressing at a higher, subsequently in contrast relevance, you would express at a lower, right? If the influence domain is then, you would say, well, was that requiresome to, the SR-71 Blackbird? Was that influence domain applied, and this additional construct equate the equal sign? What caused it? Additionally, quantum compute application to the interference domain of an observer? Potentially. Right? With a novelistic, outside of the prior predilection of pattern, maybe with that injective pattern that caused that when applied, right? Quadratic, more complex generalistically to a factor of 2, cube, right? And what? Counterintuitive to the prior logic, opposite. So handshaking, that the basic suggestion of the dye injection, here's the practitioner walks up before the nuclear medical scan, 22/7. Maybe there's just some guy in a coffee shop that says, hey, make your music with that. Right? See you later, back to Alpha Centauri. Right? It's kind of not really necessarily more complicated than as you have that technology side chaining that dye injection. Right? But like I said, you have a compute competition attempt from the entity that is the forward and temporal time, Back to the Future, the expression of that gene insert in the thing from outer space. Right? A transmutation virus that can move from idea. It has the buffer coupling code. Journalistically, look at geometry. To move from the seemingly segmented domains of genetics, presentation layer, the geometries of construct mathematics, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, so are we within another influence domain? Yes. Is it antithetical in desires designed to fruition a singular form? Well, the fact that there was a dichotomy and a distance created, or the quadratic complexifier influence in the observer domain, all of a sudden, also with, like at a black hole center, at gravitational absolute zeros, you've all of a sudden added 2 extra cubes, right? And then also counterintuitive patterns. So what that does is it goes, and then all of a sudden, you're exceeding the curvature of space-time to the factor of the square. And that causes a backwash of the pattern variant that is concurrently, compoundingly relevant in fluid dynamic form fruition in linear time, and causes the singularity of confirmation bias, backwash, the die, and the distance, and there it is. And there it goes. It looks like the desk lamp in the hotel room that you go to, that everyone sees. It's a teardrop it's like a balloon that's sagging. You turn it on its side, right? And that tip is 1918. Where you're holding it. The inlet of the balloon, approximately. And overtonally, as overtonal gravitational bands go, prior to that, less. So gravitational attention virus, like I said, a probabilistic certainty function in detection form, once detected, becomes inert in fluid dynamic continuance. Right? It's sort of like pi. What is pi? It's fire. It's like the primordial upheaval that you conjured complexly into mind and made to something that isn't. It's inherently curved, to stare at a right angle. And for an instant, the right angle and curve existed simultaneously. The observer domain was made risk-reduced with absolute certainty attention gravitation, and the induction channel not balanced outside the curvature of space-time instantaneously turns to gray. Right? And so they go back prehistory, instantaneously are and doing them. And by Plan 9, in Plan 9, the special effects aren't very good, right? It's like, these aren't aliens. This is just a movie. You're right. Hollywood, the 20th century. So the mirror of the force, the monkey is actually, it's hard to conceive outside the scope of your container what dimensional fields would necessarily be different. glitch video slide. So that's you realizing that you have lost a dimensional, experiential expression. I think it's funny, posted as viral. Why is that? Is it a fisheye lens on the cheap piece of shit camera that she's using? No. What is it? So the angle is so far as the optical data that exists on the camera, which is a product of, technologically, so you have an influx period rather than an outflux period in Germany. And Project Paperclip, are there vampires? They live, John Carpenter, and aliens. It's very cringy, and special effects. Seems like a movie. These aren't real aliens. I agree with you. That would. Hollywood. It's like the mirror booting up to confirmation bias and the existential crisis of as if death, right? Because is of the organism. It's like the organism going through the throes of its construct detection, generalistically. Right? Becoming more false in fluid dynamic as that, who runs Hollywood, right? The plastique of the starlet replaced by the literal plastique of emotions called identity politics. Go back to the Yule and Dog Meat Festival. That's Fluffy, my little dog. And I loved it. It was the biggest, one of the, he dies in the cold, right? I'm a little kid. It scars me for a good portion of my life. I'm a human being, necessarily. Insofar as a higher conscious, non-refraction organism, but man's best friend. Very basically, not expressive of this necessarily outside of naturalistic familial group, which is all, due to the self-reflexive gene. So it's a misnomer. Like birds, refraction organisms. John Nash is studying birds in the park. The complex autonomic product of an instantaneous fruition, right? Confirmation bias that always was handshaking. Back to the Future, the genetic pre-signal technology, or technology's presence logically in genetic mind interaction. That makes sense. So, the plausible presence is its presence generalistically. And its pattern is mathematical, like a conservation of energy process such as a black hole. That's why I use it as the Rorschach of its influence domain directly expresses a 0 to 100 scale. That's weird. So you don't have reduced pattern necessarily on such a long time frame of an exacting nature to a time scale expressed in nature. So you have an intent, a homogeneous intent vector expressed at all angles of space-time across a very specific mathematical given domain of space-time. So that's not naturalistically necessarily possible. Use Elliott wave logic, sure. But you say that's just Elliott. But it isn't. Now I want you to watch the end of The Arrival first, because we're dealing with, I'm a person who cries about Fluffy, but they don't necessarily. Would I cry if one of them died? Absolutely. Right? So this is the end of The Arrival, where they implementation and presentation issue where we sit past the point of what? It being a catalyst for bio and metaphysical development of the organism through its parasymbiotic relationship across space-time within the given domain of, not necessarily. So that's the logic bomb. 1918 isn't the monkey in the forest. The genetic. Identity politics. The Ulazagni fester. So, is it an appeasable, without logistical checkmate, organism via the empathetic angle? No. It's fungus, time fungus, corrected instantaneously, regardless of, insofar as this confirmation bias of existence, which is pi, right? When pi exists, it comes into the genetic, right? So that's the singular influence domain, which is the 1097 zeta function 0. Outside of that influence domain, overtonal influence is non-expressive, right? Because that's the inlet. That's the spaceship, flight of the navigator tip, the nose of it, the genetic, right? And so you see a forward disincentivization of Longfield's fruition of the on-the-day issue of, well, you have to maintenance a non-emotional interaction terrestrially, economically, and slowly, like a frog in boiling water, non-terminus, and to the tune of water, moving the socioeconomic relationship away from that organism, which is not appeasable at an emotional level at this point in time. It's a right angle, you're a curve. Its refraction inherently expressed a complex autonomic organism. That shakes your hand on the day, here it is, as massive influence, incentivization on both sides of the equation of that, whatever that is. That's not random. And so you see, pre-Hollywood's death, right? All the bootlegging in China, right? That's not random. Extreme disinterest in form field fruitioning individual and or singular hive mind hydratic individuated economy of outside of what? The shadows on the walls from Tea History 1918 haven't what? Necessarily socio-economically evolved until another catalyst presents technologically in the, look at the Silk Road, right? When does that start? Why do they say ancient Chinese secret? What is the ancient Chinese secret? 1918 approximately. They aren't necessarily human. And so why is there pattern in language? And so why is there pattern in time inherently? Well, time, as it is history memory. So your memory is the last thing to be considered in regards to time. Let's see the slash there before the memory. That's the confirmation bias. And you go back to time. And so the next book should be time as it is memory, history. With that potentiality domain of massive, as above so below, individual to individual interference domain playing maintenance as generalistically organic. With you have a factor of 2 in exponentiality of attempted roll-off of, say, effect table injection, intentionality conception that it was probabilistically impossible that we're all living on 1984, George Orwell's Animal Farm forever, probabilistically in regards to the contract relationship. So, at the point of confirmation bias, the organism still exists insofar as it's genetic, and always was, post that period of time in aesthetical expression. So, what you're looking for now to prove this is fossil record variance in aesthetic pointedly pre-1918, whatever you think that is actually. And what is passed off as the food chain of the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, insofar as time is this history memory, dictated you coming out of China. So I would say that that's largely elaborated and not accurate necessarily. Right? Needs to be reconfirmation bias given for data. As, like I said, we have the catch-22 of you're staring at the lens of history, time as it is history memory. And in it is what? You're staring at Earth as seen from space so far as the history of that is the filter of history. So it's inherently false. Does that make sense? And I would say pointedly obtuse at that zeta function 0, probably about 1918. Right. Of computational upending of in that interference domain of observer to observer outside of their board spacecraft that they've hydraulically and high-mindedly fungicide. But with an empathetic angle at the end of the arrival, right? Which is what? Self-maintenancing, they're already doing Jurassic Park in China as a result of a psychosexual, not part of the psychosexual competition playing, and you see that force reflected in the use of pornography, operant, and Pavlovian, remember the Beagle and Dogmeat Festival. There's an extreme divorcement from the consideration plan for human necessarily empathetic interference. You're coming from that projectivity plan, but man's best friend, not men's best friend. Does that make sense? Fraction. And so the genetic, as it's an unnatural insert, is something that was already complexly contrived, and more so, why such a Western inclination to this extreme desire to westernize all aesthetic? That's part of the gravitational attention conversion. It's like a parasymbiotic relationship at a higher level of mind, where you have an extreme desire to and then maintenancing the empathy through a optical filter of, because they need a presentation layer of empathy. That's called identity politics. That's why it doesn't always compute with actual rational logic, the logic motions out of that whatever. So we like Hollywood. Right? You need a watering hole of look at burnout. Right? There was largely copied most of his stagecraft and trickery in the complex form field fruitions. So he's not part of the self-reflexive print, right? He's like the pre-bifurcation of the logic of history, insofar as that is. So you have the incentive. So Jeff Goldblum equals the Chinese scientist equals the robot arm from space. Okay? So AI comes from space through the gene. Okay? So Jeff Goldblum is the parasymbiotic, instantaneous side chain expression to the Chinese scientists. That's why they're controlling the conversation about chaos. That's the induction channel of the matrix, the presentation of choice, where they're sitting on all sides of the equation, maintenancing incentive towards the fruition within the influence domain of before that, knowing that this is the case, i.e. the confirmation bias period of counter-intuitive logic injection in mass interference domain between observers individualistically and massively to a factor of 2 combined with a counterintuitive pattern injection like is experienced at a right angle as the right angle that was the exponential elliptical curve of cascading that water and printed a sphere that now is what 22/7 is water and it has more mass non-termination data than pi terminus, and so it goes and puts a face on history. So you know what it is, and at that point you don't live in Jurassic Park anymore. Life finds a way. Very basically. And that basically is the maintenancing of there never being a refruitioning, an incentivization, control at all vectors, a honeypotting of the interference domain between individual observers or massively by that entity special interest, which, like I said, attempts to sit on all sides of the equation by wearing, like, the, look at Game of Thrones, you know, the mini-face god. The mini-face god is the transmutation mind that can move from field to field, but has the inherent geometry Rorschach of what? As I'm essentially Nicholas Flamel, the philosopher's stone. Which is, you know, an instantaneous ingot of transmutation, you know, like the universe. But, you know, like an idea of it, but once conceived, the person that conceives it is kind of past the domain, a construct unto themselves. Right? And can see and that's part of, you know, creating an extra dimensional de Sitter space unto yourself to do this injection, just like the, you know, within the influence domain period, right, is kind of the point of that. But, anyways, the substance of wizardry. You know, where does magic come from? The semantics of magic. To talk about the semantics of magic, I want to, you know, burden you with When Harry Met Sally. When Harry Met Sally, what is that one with Woody Allen and Diane Keaton? Right? So, why would there be semantics leading up to magic? Or semantics outflowing from magic? Because you're within a construct layer. COVID-19. The dual narrative, a nanite overlayer, Plan 9 from outer space. Whoa. Alien. Plausible in logic, couple fruition, presented conveniently in theater by someone Neil deGrasse Tyson, part of the data organism influence apparatus. He is the pundit called upon immediately, you know, for the cameras to do the confirmation bias of, you know, so the presence of confirmation bias, known entity, is just generally a lot of pattern converging to print Dark City. Okay? Dark City, but with the grays, not aliens. And that, extra dimensional de Sitter spaces of mind, the construct layer that exists due to an active agreement to handshake with interference plane with the data organism at large. The data organism at large is the matrix. The matrix is the matrix. The matrix, if followed in logic tuple fruition, is a logic bomb to seeing the data organism, and thus confirmation biasing its existence very pointedly. The most pointed expression at the end of the 20th century, Morpheus said, right? But Neo was asleep, and before he was in a construct. And you were in the theater within the construct. So a false mother birthed into a fake confirmation bias of the most profound, the matrix is the matrix, as a metaphor and allegory at the watering cooler of the party of the world, right? Rolling your eyes. I'm right there with you. It's absurd as an allegory at some point, because it's missing an interference domain, because you've lost one in interacting with it, of logic, which is, it's taken the data organism archetype, Chinese patriarchy, right? There's no males in Jurassic Park, they're all female. Actually, they're all male. Why? You can see back reinforcing logic, the Chinese one-child system, right? So you have a basic forward handshake of not part of the psychosexual argument, and aren't necessarily part of it at all at the outset of its argument's existence, so it's counterintuitive. That's the observer to mirror camera interference domain that doesn't exist, right? Insofar as emotional logic. So never necessarily interested in, and then forward, you don't need the woman, Laura Dern, because you have the robot arm. And Jeff Goldblum is just kind of also there simultaneously to necessarily handshake that that's the case, right? In conversation. He's presenting the chaos argument. The Chinese scientist is the counterpoint. That's the induction channel, where humanity is well inside of it in the frame. Jeff Goldblum is always behind the robot arm in that scene about the egg, right? And kind of shadowed by the lawyer. Legal inroads to fruitioning and honeypotting communications. So forced medication inroads, incentivization vector, causal factors to doing that all need to be assessed as threat vector and recurrence and attempt to reseat. So, fear prop around some sort of causal, then communications re-reflect prior convergence patterning, then probabilistic fruition, Board 2.0. Very bad. So, it's the quantum compute race, which is what? It's the first dog at the gate gets the rabbit. And with compounding contrast logistically, and so a maintenancing of this at all vectors of threat general, but the compute fluid dynamic maintenance is probably the most in sort of counterintuitive logic generalistically than the Chinese injection into general fluid dynamic patterning contrast variance, so that the particles in the conservation energy process, which not necessarily has to be that, So a black hole tears particles apart. We don't want to do that to ourselves, right? That's the false mother, right? So we want to make a wormhole which has forward gravitational propagating potentiality and continuance, rather than something that comes to singularity at epochs and with severity expression that singularity upon the experiential and expression of time as it is now, hopefully, memory, history, life, whatever that is at this point in time.